Welcome to another episode of Mike's Money Picks. Today on the podcast, college football is not quite back just yet, but we're going to kick off our coverage of the 2025 college football season by discussing what I believe to be the future of fantasy for college football, and that is college football best ball drafts. Specifically, we're going to be talking about best ball drafts on Underdog here in this episode. What we're going to do is we're going to introduce the format if you are uninitiated, and then we are going to discuss all of the different kind of strategies and information that you're going to need in order to draft the most successful best ball teams on Underdog for the 2025 season. Now, if you have not already, make sure you are subscribed to the channel. That way you can be with us for the rest of our college football content this summer. And it's going to be a lot. I'm talking season previews. I'm talking live drafts. I'm talking, week by week DFS previews once the season starts. So you're going to want to make sure you're going to be here for all that. So make sure you're subscribed to the channel. That way you can be with us for all of it. And oh, by the way, we are closing in on our 1,000 subscriber goal. We only need 10 more. So if you have not hit that subscribe button yet, help me out and hit that button. And hopefully this episode, we're going to give you guys a ton of information that's going to help you with these Underdog drafts. Now, I do know the Underdog has not released their drafts just yet for this season, but what we're able to do here is we're just kind of assuming that it's the same format as last year, and we're kind of assuming that, they're going to be introducing them here soon. We're kind of getting ahead of the curve, and I've done a lot of research and got a lot of information, you guys, that is going to help you guys master these Underdog best ball drafts this year. So let's go ahead and get started, and let's dive in and break it down. So if you have played best ball on Underdog before, specifically with NFL, you are probably going to be fairly familiar with the format for Underdog's college football best ball contests. Basically, what happens is you are going to be doing a 20-round draft. Last year, they offered both fast drafts and slow drafts. And at the end of every week, you are going to have automatically started from your team one quarterback, 2 running backs, 2 receivers, 1 tight end, 1 flex, and 1 super flex every single week. Automatically done for you. You do not have to do start sit. You do not have to trade. You do not have to add drop players. The team you draft here in July and August is the team that you end up with, and those start to sit decisions are made for you. And what ends up happening is every contest plays 12 weeks or 11 weeks, and then weeks 12, 13, and 14 are the playoffs for Underdog contests. More on that a little bit later, but the goal is to be in the top 2 in your drafting room so that way you can advance your team to the playoffs. Now, with that format, right, with 1 super flex being started, that means you can start a quarterback in that spot in addition to the quarterback that you're already starting. So ideally, the super flex format allows you to start 2 quarterbacks every single week. Now, one thing that you are going to need to be considering, though, is that every team in college football has at least 2 buys in the season. 2. And last year on Underdog, they were not listed on the player card like they are for NFL. So it's going to need to be something that you are going to need to keep track of as you're drafting. You're going to need to either find a schedule or a database or something to know who has what bye weeks as you move forward and keep track of that. Now, last year, week 0 kind of threw a wrench into things, right? We know college football has week 0 that, it's the first week, the kickoff week before official week 1. So in 2024 in Underdog contest, week 0 did not count. But every team that played in week 0, such as Florida State and Georgia Tech, had a week 1 game. So what ended up happening was if you drafted a team that played in week 0, then you got the score from their week 1 game, and the team ended up with 3 buys throughout the season because they had an additional game in week 0 and they had to drop another week, right? So it was not ideal to draft some of these players in 2024 because you got 0 credit for the week 0 game. Now, here's how this is slightly different this year. This year, there are 4 week 0 teams: Iowa State, Kansas, and Stanford. So conventionally, if it turns out like last year, you would just get the week 1 score for all of those teams. However, Stanford has a week 1 bye. So what you're going to be looking at is, do they end up counting the better of the 2 scores between week 0 and week 1 because Stanford has the week 1 bye? I think that's a possibility, but I don't really know enough to speculate on it just yet. But what you're going to end up with is those 4 teams are going to end up with 3 buys unless they decide to change how the rule works out. Now, as we mentioned earlier, you get to start 2 quarterbacks a week, right? So you're going to want to make sure that you have plenty of depth at every position. And so here's what I recommend doing. I recommend drafting between 4 and 6 quarterbacks, 5 and 6 running backs, 6 to 8 wide receivers, and only 2 tight ends. More on those stipulations later. But generally speaking, if you look at successful lineups last year, if you look at successful drafted teams last year, that was the format that they follow more often than not. It was 4 to 6 quarterbacks, 5 to 6 running backs, 6 to 8 wide receivers, and only 2 tight ends. Now, we mentioned also the Underdog playoff contests, or Underdog tournaments, I should say, have playoffs in week 12, 13, and 14. which is the end of the college football regular season. Week 14 is the last week, Thanksgiving weekend, rivalry week, all that, right? So what you have, because some, with college teams having 2 byes, some of them have quite late byes. And so this year, there are a host of teams that have byes in week 12 and week 13. So what I would recommend doing is I would recommend taking a screenshot of this page if you're watching on YouTube right now, or writing it down or finding yourself some website or some database that has all this information, because all of these teams have a bye in week 12, which is the first round of the playoffs on Underdog. Auburn, Cal, Colorado, Houston, Indiana, Iowa State, Kansas, Nebraska, Rutgers, SMU, Stanford, Syracuse, and Vanderbilt. Interestingly enough, 3 of those teams also have week 0 byes. So like when you're drafting teams and when you're ranking players, you have to consider that if you draft a Kansas player or an Iowa State player or a Stanford player, that you're not only getting 1 less week of production from them, but you're also not able to use them in the first round of the playoffs on Underdog. That has to be considered when you're drafting and when you're ranking. As for week 13, slightly shorter list: Boston College, Mississippi State, Ole Miss, Oregon State, Purdue, Texas Tech, Virginia, and West Virginia. So super huge factor when you're drafting is going to be consider those playoff bye teams. Also, I don't believe I mentioned this before, but Underdog's college football best ball drafts only involve the Power 4 conferences and the Pac-12, in quotation marks, Oregon State and Washington State and Notre Dame. So you're not seeing group of 5 teams on this list. You will not be drafting from group of 5 players. Now, one thing I wanted to look at was, everybody last year, because here's the interesting thing with best ball. What you saw last year was just there were a bunch of different kinds of people drafting, and there were a bunch of different kinds of people making content for Underdog best ball contests, right? And one thing that like all the NFL best ball guys that like tried to instantly make college best ball content to like stream some drafts wanted to say was, oh, you got to treat week 14 in college like it's week 17 in the NFL. You got to stack up your games on week 14. So, Texas and Texas A&M, you got to stack them against each other. Alabama and Auburn, you got to stack them against each other. I don't think that's necessarily the case. Now, that strategy has become quite popular in the NFL in best ball drafts and contests like Best Ball Mania, where there's these huge prize pools and you want to get every bit as much of correlation as possible. And so the concept is if you draft 2 players, such as from the, I don't know, let's say the Panthers and Buccaneers. I don't know if they play on week 17 or not, but if you draft 2 players from those 2 teams and that game ends up being a shootout, then you can end up getting a ton of points from that one game, right? In college fantasy football last year, that didn't really pan out with any like individual games in week 14. But what I did want to point out was, and this is going to be a strategy that I'm going with this year, is different conferences score different amounts of points throughout the season. And so what I mean by that is I assumed this was just going to be the Big 12 before I actually sat down and looked at the scoring and did all the math. But what ended up happening was this: the Big 12 and the SEC did a lot of scoring in weeks 12, 13, and 14. They did a lot of scoring in conference play. And the reason why is because for the most part in the Big 12 and the ACC, the defenses are quite weak. And you saw a lot of teams that were just able to just, pinball points off of each other going against weak defenses. And the defenses that they were seeing in the Big 12 and the ACC were weaker than the ones that you see in the Big 10 and the SEC that a lot of those teams were seeing in non-conference, right? And so what you see with the Big 10 and the SEC is that because when they play non-conference games, they're playing teams with weaker defenses, a lot of their scoring is based off of non-conference weeks, right? And so what you see if you're looking at my chart here on YouTube, the SEC had massively high averages in week 12 and week 13 for individual team scoring, right? But that was because a lot of teams played non-conference in those weeks. The SEC has Cupcake Saturday. And so a lot of teams played an FCS or group of 5 opponent in week 12 or week 13 and were able to score a lot of points. But then in week 14, when all the SEC teams were against each other for rivalry weekend, they were actually the lowest scoring conference of all 4. So here's what I mean to say with all that is when you're drafting your teams, consider the conference as like a part of your team and a part of the correlation. Big 12 players are going to tend to score more points at the end of the season when they're going up against other Big 12 defenses. Same deal with the ACC. Big 10 and SEC teams are going to tend to score more points at the start of the season as they're going up against non-conference foes that are not as strong defensively as their conference counterparts. And when you get towards the end of the season, you're going to want to check the teams you're drafting's week 12, 13, and 14 schedule. Because as we just mentioned with the Cupcake Saturday of the SEC, the last thing you want to do is draft, say, I don't know, Ryan Williams from Alabama, and he plays a game against Western Carolina and only scores 1 touchdown and only has 41 yards because his team's up 42-0 at half. So that's going to be something that you're going to have to consider as you're drafting your teams, is who they're playing against in week 12 and week 12, 13, and 14. And I think that it's going to be a quite big deal to target players that are in the ACC and in the Big 12 for those weeks, but also balance it out with a few guys on the SEC and the Big 10s. That way you can what's the word I'm looking for here? Own the board with, scoring over the course of all 14 weeks. I probably should have mentioned this, but the chart on YouTube that you're looking at is teams average in scoring in points per game in week 12, 13, and 14. So the higher number, the higher the average for all teams in that conference scoring in points per game. So you also had your outliers, like the Big 12 has the highest average for week 13, 30.4, but there were also some Big 12 teams that scored more than that and less than that in that week. But in general, what this is saying is that in the playoff weeks on Underdog Best Ball Contest, the ACC and the Big 12 scored more points. And what we want to target players on teams that score points. That seems pretty self-explanatory, but if you're drafting a guy on a good offense and that offense is scoring 7 touchdowns, it's a lot more likely that that guy's going to score a touchdown. And so that is why I went in and did this research. That's why I kind of got it here for you guys. I kind of wish I would have done that in a different order, but I think you guys get the picture. Is at the end of the day, you're going to need to have ceiling weeks in the playoffs if you want to win any money. And so you're going to need to target guys from the conferences, the ACC and the Big 12. They're scoring more points in those weeks. Now, let's talk about myself personally, because I don't think I'll be doing you guys justice to talk about this contest without revealing what I did in 2024. So because I went on vacation for part of the drafting season in a state that didn't have Underdog college drafts, I was only able to draft 24 teams across Underdog's flagship contest, Best Bowl Mania, and the Tailgate, which was their $3 draft. What I did was I advanced 7 of those 24 teams to the playoffs, which is quite good because 1 out of 6 teams, aka 2 out of 12 that you draft with, advanced to the playoffs in the first 11 weeks. And so the average would have been 4 out of 24. I was able to get 7. I'm quite proud of that. Now, from there, each contest has a different advance rate for each stage of the playoffs, week 13 and week 14. I don't know what that's going to be for any of the contests this year. I'm not going to speculate on it now, but I advanced 2 of my 7 teams past week 12 into week 13, but I only advanced actually, I didn't advance any of them from week 13 to week 14. I was 0 for 2. So I did not end up with any team in the finals on either of those contests in week 14, which ended with my season being a net negative in terms of profitability. Basically, you need to get a team to the finals in order to be profitable. That's why that playoff scoring, like we were just talking about, is so crucial, because you need to be getting players on your teams that are going to score a lot of points in week 12 and week 13, because you can advance nearly double the normal advance rate like I did, but you can still lose money on the season if you're not able to get one of those teams to the finals. And the way that you get those teams to the finals is by hitting ceiling weeks in the playoffs in week 12 and week 13, which again is more likely to come from higher scoring games and higher scoring teams. I think I tied a bow around that nicely. We're going to go ahead and break down the 2024 in general here after this quick break. All right, so before we continue, I do want to mention that if you are enjoying this content, if you're watching on YouTube, please hit the like button. It helps me out a ton when you guys do that. It helps videos get noticed, helps grow the community, and just so on and so forth. Also, I am going to be having my Underdog rankings on my Patreon, patreon.com/Mike'sMoneyPicks. Link is in the description. I don't have my rankings yet because Underdog uses the specific player codes, and it's going to be just a lot easier for me to upload the rankings for Underdog once Underdog has the spreadsheet that you can edit and upload. And so just, if you want my rankings, subscribe to the Patreon and you'll have those when Underdog release the contest. All right. So here's what I wanted to do. I wanted to kind of give the quick takeaways from 2024, how people drafted, how it worked out, what happened at different positions, what happened for different strategies. And just going to kind of give like a bird's eye view of everything you need to know to head into 2025 with the lessons that we learned from 2024, which was the first time any of us ever did this, right? So before we talk about anything specific, I want to discuss the picture that you're looking at if you're watching on YouTube, which is the survivorship bias plane, right? So survivorship bias is a huge concept in statistics, because basically the survivorship bias plane, the source of this image is basically planes that were, landed after flying a mission in some sort of war. I think it might have been World War II. They were studied for where they were shot, right? Um, and what that does is, you kind of create a map of where the planes get shot. But the problem is that they're only looking at the planes that came back. They're not looking at the planes that got shot down or the planes that blew up, right? And so what I'm talking about here is this. We only have the information for 2024 based off of what actually played out in the 2024 season. Right. So some things happen in 2024 that might not happen again, that might not happen the same way again. And so we're talking about a 1-year sample size that we only have based off of the players that were drafted on Underdog where they were drafted. And so it could end up being totally different this year, but we're just right now talking about the takeaways from 2024. And so basically, we're taking a look at our planes and we're seeing what happened, right? So in the early draft in 2024, having the number 1 overall pick ended with a terrible advance rate. And the reason why is, and before I continue, when I say advance rate, I mean the rate that these teams advance to the playoffs in 12-team leagues. And I'm getting these numbers from not only my own teams and my own lobbies, but also some data from Twitter as well. But the pick 1.01, the number 1 overall pick, ended with a terrible advance rate. And the reason why is because most of the time, people that had the number 1 overall pick drafted Ollie Gordon from Oklahoma State, who looked like a terrific running back and a terrific pick, ended up being a bust in this contest, didn't really live up to expectations, was not able to kind of carry your team. And oh, by the way, he had a week 12 bye, so he was not really any help for you in round 1 of the playoffs. Because of the fact that he wasn't playing in round 1 of the playoffs. So does that necessarily mean that the first overall pick is going to be bad this year? No, but here's what it does mean. It does mean this. And I will say this, speaking from experience last year, I got the number 1 overall pick once. So the one time that I had that pick, I felt like I had to take Ollie Gordon, because if I didn't take Ollie Gordon and Ollie Gordon ended up just breaking college football, then I would have needed that one team to be good, right? And so I do feel like when you're drafting these teams, especially in the early part of the first round, you're going to want to kind of mix up your portfolio. You're not really going to want to deviate, because let's say this year that I don't know, let's say Cade Klubnik is the consensus number 1 overall pick. Well, then when you get the number 1 overall pick, you better draft Cade Klubnik or you're going to end up with no Cade Klubnik, right? Kind of think about the same way in NFL. When you get the number 1 overall pick right now, you take Jamar Chase. You don't really think twice about it, because that's the only way you're going to get Jamar Chase. You're not going to get him in any of your other drafts. And so that kind of groupthink does kind of change how you have to look at those early picks. Now, what also ended up happening in round 1 was drafting a receiver in round 1 was a mixed bag. Teteroa McMillan and Luther Burden were the only 2 receivers that were regularly selected in round 1 last year, and McMillan did have a better season overall than Burden. The half PPR format really hurt Luther Burden because he ended up being like a low ADOT slot king, right? He was not a guy that scored a lot of points in half PPR. And so Luther Burden ended up with a much disappointing season, very low advance rate out of those teams. The Tet McMillan teams were a mixed bag. Now, in round 2, running backs were king. Quarterbacks and wide receivers in round 2 ended up being awful. And after round 2, success was a little more normalized, a little bit more varied among the positions. But let's go ahead and talk about round 1 and round 2 a little bit. So what ended up happening last year was, because of the super flex format, and because of the kind of the group of people that ended up drafting these contests, quarterbacks shot up the board last year. There were more quarterbacks that were taken in round 1 that probably should have been. Like, we were doing, I do these drafts on fan tracks with kind of a different group of people that you see on Underdog, and quarterbacks do not fly off the board in those drafts because those people are experienced college fantasy football drafters. They know the value of the quarterback. They know that there's a lot of quarterbacks out there, right? And so the value of the quarterback in those drafts stayed down significantly. But the super flex format on Underdog really talked people into taking quarterbacks early and often. And so I think you ended up seeing quarterbacks shoot up the board more so than their value actually was. And so what you saw was the round 2 quarterbacks were busts, and quarterback starts ended up with awful teams. Generally speaking, the highest success rate that you saw in the early draft in 2024 was by starting your draft through 2 rounds with 1 quarterback and 1 running back in either order. And that would kind of give you the best blueprint for success. Now, let's go ahead and talk about those quarterbacks. So here's what I mean when I say that, quarterbacks got thrust up the board when they should not have been. The actual top 5 quarterbacks in ADP last year did not bust. They were all pretty solid. They all gave you, pretty solid performances. Dylan Gabriel, Jalen Milroe, Garrett Green, Jackson Dart, Avery Johnson. All were solid. No complaints about that group of 5 if you drafted them in the first round. But the round 2 quarterbacks, which were the next 4, I'm talking Nico Ilamaliava, KJ Jefferson, Kyron Drones, Thomas Castellanos, they were largely busts. And so I've got my note here, don't scramble for quarterbacks. What that means is this: don't panic if quarterbacks get thrown up the board. Don't draft quarterbacks that don't deserve to be drafted where their value is just because you feel like you need a quarterback. Because you could find later round QBs that equaled or surpassed production from the top. Last year, John Mateer from Washington State, now at Oklahoma, was the number 1 quarterback overall. You could have him much later in drafts. Cam Ward, Kyle McCord, Clay Klubnik, and Riley Leonard, that is 5 quarterbacks, were all top 10 quarterbacks at the end of the season that were drafted from outside the top 10 in terms of ADP. So half of the top 10 quarterbacks were not drafted in the top 10 in these underdog drafts. So you can find quarterback late. Also, here's another one thing that means: taking your second and third quarterback fast is vastly overrated. Because as long as you end up with a good quarterback, you're not going to be needing to replace that good quarterback very often. Last year, Cade Klubnik only had 1 game under 19 fantasy points. It was against Georgia. We all could have seen that coming. So if you had Cade Klubnik on your team, who ended up being a top 10 quarterback, you likely only need to make up for 1 dud performance as well as the buys. You can't gain a whole lot of points from ceiling performances at QB as long as you find 2 good ones. And the reason why is, Cade had 11 games over 19 fantasy points. And, for a quarterback to have a ceiling performance that's going to out replace that one, they'd need what? If you score 25, you're getting 6 points. You score 28, you're getting 9 points. And it takes a lot for quarterbacks to score 28 fantasy points, right? So as long as you find 2 good quarterbacks, you don't really need a whole lot to be replaced. And so if you draft your 2 quarterbacks early, or you draft 1 quarterback early and have your late sleeper in mind, you're not going to need a whole lot of draft capital to be spent on the quarterback position. And so at the end of the day, taking 5 to 6 is optimal. So that way you make sure you end up with 2 good ones. But I don't think that you need to rush to take your second and third one super fast, because the third and fourth and fifth and sixth quarterback are not going to be guys that you just need 1 week from. You're just looking to find a guy that finishes the season in the top 10, as opposed to, a spot start replacement that can start maybe 4 or 5 weeks over the course of the season. I'm hoping that makes sense, but just consider the math behind it, right? You only need, if you draft Cade Klubnik and he has the season he had last year, you only need a quarterback to replace him for 1 week. And so you don't need to be spending a whole lot of your draft capital on other quarterbacks for that 1 week. You just need to take a few, so that way you have enough shots at hitting the lottery and hitting one that ends up finishing really high at the end of the season. Now, at the running back position, running backs through 2 rounds last year had the lowest bust rate out of any position. By far, the top running backs last year were money. After that, running backs were hit or miss, but there were a few true gems out there that if you were able to get on your team were true league winners, which was RJ Harvey, Cam Scatterboot, and Dylan Sampson. Sampson was a guy that I had a ton of. That is one call that I will victory lap here. I was really high on Dylan Sampson at the end of the season, drafted him a ton, and ended up reaping the rewards for that. He was on a lot of my advancing teams. But here's the bottom line at running back. The top of the player pool at running back is the best out of all of them, and it's more difficult at any other position to hit on mid to late round running backs, because there's just not a whole lot. Because after you get past the first top tier running backs, you are looking at guys who are in a committee. You are looking at guys who are in pass happy offenses. You are looking at guys who are backups even. You're just not looking at true starting workhorse running backs in good offenses after the first few rounds. And so you want to make sure that you end up with those on your team. And then when you draft running backs late, you want to try to get a guy who fits those criteria. Again, you want them to be workhorses, not in a committee, and you want them to be on good offenses so they can score touchdowns, not on bad offenses where they don't. So last year, there were really only 3 late round running backs that even made a difference. Anthony Hankerson of Oregon State, Jeremiah Love of Notre Dame, another guy I was on a lot, and Desmond Reed of Pitt, they were all great, but no other real late round running backs really moved the needle. There weren't a whole lot of guys that you could have drafted that were like projected to be backups or projected to be committee members that really ended up hitting their value. Like all three of those guys were projected starters on their team, and in offenses that ended up exceeding expectations. Now, let's go ahead and talk about wide receivers. However, there's one caveat on this one. Underdog in their scoring for best ball is half PPR scoring. All the data that I have here is from PPR scoring because the only totals that I have access to are from Fantrax, which are PPR. Underdog doesn't give like a huge data sheet with like all their totals, and I don't have the time or patience to go back and find it. I'm just going to use PPR from Fantrax. So at the wide receiver position, wide receiver ADP related to performance and advance rate had the least correlation of any position. What that means is it didn't matter if you drafted a receiver early, middle, late rounds, you never knew what you were going to get. And so you can just find late round wide receivers that can be more productive than your early round wide receivers. It was also much easier to find late round wide receivers that were productive than any other position. So receiver is the one where the draft position matters less. Does that mean that you need to go out and just like punt wide receiver and do like a zero wide receiver build? Probably not, but it does mean that generally speaking, this is the position that you can throw darts at late. This is also the position where it can just be totally random with who ends up succeeding. Now, a big concept of best ball, especially from the NFL side, is stacking, right? Everybody wants to stack their quarterbacks with their wide receivers. I do believe that stacking is slightly less significant in college football than in NFL, but I do believe it is an important concept. The bottom line is this: when you stack, you are placing a bet that the offense is going to be good. If I draft Arch Manning, and I'm convinced that Arch Manning is going to throw 35 touchdowns, well, then I need to draft a few receivers who are going to catch some of those 35 touchdowns, right? So I'm going to be taking the Ryan Wingos and the DeAndre Moores and the Emmett Mosleys of the world, if that's the case, right? Because I'm making a bet on the Texas offense because I have Arch Manning. I hope that makes sense. So at the end of the year last year, receivers being on a good offense mattered more than any other position. Only two of the top 20 finishing wide receivers, Brennan Presley of Oklahoma State and Andrew Armstrong of Arkansas, were on offenses that scored less than 28 points per game, which was the top 50 in FBS. So two receivers out of 20, that's 1/10, were outside of the top 50 best offenses in the sport. So you want receivers from good offenses. And like I said, if you take a quarterback, that largely means that you're going to think the offense is going to be good. Now, I do think that some quarterbacks are more stackable than others. Like, for instance, if I draft Lenoris Sellers or an Avery Johnson who scores a lot of their fantasy points with their legs, I don't feel the need to stack them because they're just not going to be targeting wide receivers, at a super high rate. They're not going to have a super high pass rate. Their offense is going to be running the ball a lot with them. So definitely stacking matters for some teams more than others. And to kind of back that up, 5 of the top 10 wide receivers last year were stacked with a top 10 quarterback. That's half. So if you are taking a top quarterback, or if you do think that a quarterback is going to be near the top and he's not a big time scrambling quarterback, then you might want to stack him with at least one of their wide receivers. Now, I do think that it is kind of a, what's the word I'm looking here? Like, not a wild goose chase, but something kind of similar to that in like just chasing multiple receivers from the same team. What you might end up with is some ceiling games where if the quarterback goes off 300 yards and 3 touchdowns, you might end up with like multiple wide receiver performances for 1 week that benefit you. But over the course of the season, multiple receivers from the same team don't really pan out a whole lot. Only 2 of the top 20 wide receivers last year were teammates, and that was Higgins and Knoll from Iowa State. If you drafted any other combination of teammates, and then you didn't end up with 2 top 20 guys. Now LaJohntay Wester and Travis Hunter were pretty good from Colorado. That was kind of close to the top. Alec Manor and Emmett Mosley from Stanford, not bad as well. But the odds of them both over the course of a season having good numbers is not great. But like I said, in individual game outcomes, you might want to draft multiple receivers from the same team. But over the course of the season, I don't necessarily think you want that. You might have more upside by targeting other guys. Now, to the last position, tight end. Honestly, tight end is very irrelevant in Underdog Fantasy Football. There, I said it. Last season, only 2 tight ends that finished the season healthy averaged more than 10 Underdog Fantasy points per game. Oronde Gadsden of Syracuse and Tyler Warren of Penn State. Both of them had incredibly high advanced rates. Both of them were incredibly useful in the format because they were just so much better than every other tight end. Now, the problem with those two is that they were drafted in entirely different spots. Oronde Gadsden was the first tight end off the board. You had drafted him in round 3. Tyler Warren was drafted in the 12th-ish round. So, obviously the advance rate on Warren was a little higher, given that the scoring between the two of them was quite comparable, and Warren was drafted significantly later. But those were the only two that really made a difference last year. Basically, every other tight end contributed so little to your roster that drafting more than 2 tight ends was simply making your roster worse because it did not allow you more opportunities for other positions. So this year, I'm only drafting 2 tight ends. And if they end up being bad, fine, because I'm only missing out on like 6 points. And that 6 points, over the course of the season, it might seem like a lot. But if I'm making up that 6 points because I have more receivers and running backs that are contributing to my team, then it's going to be worth it. I'm not going to be drafting more than 2 tight ends this year. And hey, who's to say that I can't find the next Oronde Gadsden or Tyler Warren? I might be able to, but I'm not going to be wasting roster spots for a position that is largely irrelevant in this format. In terms of kind of chasing a ceiling outcome. I think the number 1 tight end this year drafted is probably going to be Kenyon Sadiq of Oregon, and I don't think he's probably going to be drafted anywhere near as high as Oronde Gadsden was last year. And so I'm wondering if the rest of the draft lobbies on Underdog are going to catch up to this. It's going to be really interesting to see how people draft this year compared to last year. Will quarterbacks fly off the board? Will people make this adjustment on tight end? Will people value running backs more like I'm advocating for? We'll see. And so, like I said, that's why I'm going to be waiting for the contest to come out to post my rankings, because I do think ADP should matter in rankings, because I need to see how people are drafting. Because if everybody's drafting quarterbacks, well, then I need to make sure I have some quarterbacks near the top, or I'm never going to get them. So that is going to be coming out soon. Now, the last thing I want to talk about, handcuffing. So if you're familiar with the concept of handcuffing is when you draft 2 running backs from the same team. And if one of them gets injured, you get the fantasy points for the other one, right? So like concept in the NFL would be like, I'm drafting Saquon Barkley and I'm drafting Will Shipley, because if Saquon Barkley gets hurt, Will Shipley's going to take over that role. And the concept is Will Shipley's basically going to be Saquon Barkley. Last year in NFL, it worked quite well if you did Christian McCaffrey and Jordan Mason, because Christian McCaffrey never played and Jordan Mason was great when he was out there, right? In college football, handcuffing running backs was not a strategy worth trying. There just were not any real successful handcuffs at the running back position. The running backs who got injured, the teammate who took over for them either did not produce a whole lot, or it just didn't work, right? So the only situation I would say might be worth targeting in this manner is Penn State, because they do have such a high rush rate as a team, and both Allen and Singleton are usable on any given week because they split the carries 50-50, and generally whoever gets the touchdowns is the guy who ends up being usable. So you could view a situation where you draft both of them and hope to catch some weekly upside in general, but then if one of them does get hurt, you do end up getting big time upside from the other one. So to me, that would be the only team that would even be worth thinking about. But like last year, both of them finished the season all healthy because they split the carries 50-50. And generally speaking, it was difficult week in and week out to predict which one was going to have the big week. So it's not a strategy that I would recommend. But if I were to try it with any backfield, it would probably be with those Penn State backs, Allen and Singleton. Ironically, handcuffing quarterback worked in one situation, because last year when drafts started, we did not know who was going to start at quarterback for Washington State between John Mateer and Zevi Eckhouse. And so what a lot of people did, and I had a lineup that did this, people drafted both Mateer and Eckhouse and just said, hey, whichever one of them ends up starting, I got me a top 10 quarterback. And guess what? They did, because John Mateer finished as the number 1 overall quarterback. So Zevi Eckhouse actually had a really high advance rate last year, even though he did not play a significant snap for Washington State, because there were people that drafted Mateer and Eckhouse teams. Now, why did that work? Because we knew that it was a quarterback competition between 2 guys. We had no idea who was going to win it. And we knew that the offense was going to be very good because it was Ben Arbuckle at Washington State. It was a productive scheme. When Cam Ward was there, we knew that it was very quarterback friendly. And just whoever won the job was going to instantly be very good in fantasy formats, right? I don't think there's a situation like that this year that truly works out like that. I mean, maybe Caden Salter and Julian Lewis at Colorado, but I don't I don't think that's like is very clear and obvious of a good offense from a quarterback perspective as Washington State was last year. But just wanted to kind of put that out there that last year we did have a quarterback competition that did significantly impact drafts, because if Mateer was known to be the starter heading into the season, he would have been drafted much higher. But you kind of subvert your way around that by drafting both guys in the quarterback competition, in that case, Mateer and Eckhouse. Now, I do want to mention this. That's going to kind of close us up for all the info here today. I do want to mention, if you found this interesting and you want more college football content that's not from me, because first off, you should be subscribing to my channel so that you can be with us for all of our live drafts and all of our content. But there is the College Football Podcast from Fantasy Points, which is hosted by Josh Chevalier, Eric Froton, Mike Bainbridge, Zach Hall. They're all four great. They're the best in the business. They do podcasts every week on different aspects of college fantasy football. Best ball is a lot of it, and I highly recommend checking them out. And then there's also another podcast called Ballin' with My Bestie that is on Campus to Canton's network. They're specifically talking about underdog best ball contests. They've done a lot of unique stuff so far. And then also, I mentioned these earlier, but private best ball leagues, not with underdog, that are on Fantrax, that feature the entire FBS. They're a whole lot of fun. Guy that runs them is named Carp. It's at CarpG926 on Twitter, or just reach out to me. I can put you in touch with Carp because he runs everything through a Discord. And it's just a blast to draft those with the full FBS. I think DraftKings is missing a big opportunity by not offering full FBS contests because they have the full database, but that's a story for another time. But if you want to join some other best ball leagues that are not underdog, that use the full FBS, Carp is the guy to contact, and I would be more than happy to help put you in contact with him so you could get in some of those leagues. Now, there's also 4 really good, really credible preseason guys that are out now as I'm recording this in July. Let Purple Rain on Twitter is one guy that has them. The CFF site is another one. Campus to Canton just has theirs. And then Fantasy Points, theirs is free. And theirs is quite good as well. So just, if you want like links to any of those or like advice on any of those, reach out to me. I'm more than happy to help you out with that. It's at Mike's Money Picks on Twitter if you want my advice on any of that. But yeah, just wanted to kind of get you guys the info. If you're looking for more college football content, if you're looking for more ways to prepare for these underdog drafts, there you go. There's some other guys out there that are doing good work around the business and can help you get prepared. But like I said, hopefully this video or podcast, depending on how you're listening to it, gave you plenty of information in order to help you prepare and help you dominate your underdog college football drafts this season. If this video helps you out in any way, please hit the like button on YouTube. Please rate and review the audio and make sure you're subscribed. That way you can be with us for the rest of the college football season and help us get to our goal of 1,000 subscribers this summer. Now, as I'm recording this, probably going to be talking a lot of golf the next few weeks, but also if Underdog does finally kind of host these contests, if I am not on vacation, I'm going to be doing some live drafts. So make sure you're subscribed to the channel. That way you can be with us for those live drafts. Hop in the chat, tell me who I need to take. But also, if you were kind of expecting player takes and thoughts on this podcast, I'm going to kind of save those for a later date once we have the contests, because then I can, kind of have my take versus ADP or my take versus the ranking. And it'd also be really good to kind of talk through those in a live draft setting as well. So we got that to look forward to before the summer ends. But anyway, that's going to do us here for this episode, y'all. Hopefully helped you guys prepare for these underdog drafts. Let me know what you think. Reach out to me in the YouTube comments, reach out to me on Twitter. I'm more than happy to hear you guys' thoughts. If you guys got any questions, whatnot, I'm more than happy to help. That's what I'm here for. I don't claim to have all the answers, but I do not get outworked for all the answers. I can say that much. And so hopefully I'll be able to help you guys out and help you guys kill it on Underdog here this year. That's going to do it for this episode, y'all. Thank you guys for watching and listening to this point. Best of luck to you guys with your underdog drafts this season, and I will see you guys next time.